Guys, thank you very much, everybody, for joining on New Year's Eve. 2020 will go down in history as a very memorable year for many reasons. I think nobody in the world was expecting the COVID pandemic to be having such extensive ramifications. Uh, Sorry, it is Christmas Eve. Thanks, Kashish, for correcting me. And on this Christmas Eve, we have a very interesting session webinar on ovarian cancer. And I do not want to waste time because we have other things to do after the webinar is over, of course. And uh, shall I request Dr. Aditi Sarkar to please start the first session? Aditi is a senior research scientist with a focus on molecular oncology from Dr. Lal's Path Lab. So Aditi, over to you, please.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you for this. So, yes, as decided, I'll be talking about a perspective on ovarian cancer biomarkers. I'll be discussing about the past, present, and yet to come view for the mainly on the molecular aspects. Okay.
Ma'am, have you shared the slides?
Yeah, I have.
No, ma'am,
Is
we
it not
can't see them.
visible?
No, not yet, ma'am.
Just a second.
Ma'am, you'll have to try doing it again.
Shared. Okay, is it visible now?
Yes, ma'am, it's visible now.
If you can make it full
Okay.
screen, perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay. Okay. So that's the topic, and so this is a very traditional slide. You can see it is epidemiology. This slide I have included because we need to know why we need to find out the biomarkers for ovarian cancer, because it accounts around 3 to 4% of cancer in women, and it leads fifth most frequent cause of the cancer-related death in female in US, and second most common gynecological malignancies. It has also heritable factors for the ovarian cancers, and it goes up to nearly 25%. The one of the other causes, generally it is diagnosed in the stage 4 and stage 3. So there the complication starts for the treatment. So there are very common risk factors: nulliparity, infertility, early menarche or menopause, or family history, prolonged use of ovulation-induced drugs, or hormonal therapy. But I'll take one of the factor out of this bucket, that is the family history, which contributes to the hereditary cancer, and that is one of the major factor for the ovarian cancer also. So just brief about hereditary versus somatic cancer. So hereditary is such a thing where we inherit the mutations from our parents. It is from the germline, like gametes. So the mutation is there in the gametes. The embryo will also have the mutation, and full body, every cell will have the mutation in it, in the body, and it can also inherit to the next generation. For the somatic mutation, the mutation is only there in the, it can be there in any part of the body, but like in case of ovarian cancer, it is only in the ovary. But the gametes are normal, so it is not likely to pass in the next generation. So there are different criteria for the testing, and here you can see it is from the NCCN guideline, the latest version. When the testing criteria is met, so follow-up things are done, and we need to see whether there is any familial history for the particular like pathogenic variants in the patient, or there is no familial history for the pathogenic variants in the patient. So if there is a familial thing, then the particular pathogenic variant can be tested in the for the further thing, further categorization. But if it is not familial, then multi-gene panels are recommended for testing, because uh, it will completely comprehensive view of the genes and the mutation profile. So that is the thing. So when you see hereditary cancer, it is a lifetime risk for the cancer-associated genes. And in the case of BRCA1, if you see, it is it gives increased risk up to 35 to 60%, and in the case of BRCA2 it is 30 to 55%. When compared to the general population, it is only 1 to 2%. And MMR, that is mismatch repair genes, if there is any defect in these genes, the risk factor increases up to 6 to 20%. This is a very old kind of thing, because I have taken, you can see the references also. It is a very old kind, but still it is followed in many places, because we get the samples mainly for the BRCA1 and BRCA2 and the MMR thing. So it is still followed, but there are new updates. You can see they in the NCCN guidelines and ESCO guidelines, they have also mentioned there are various different other genes which also take part in the hereditary part of the ovarian cancer. So these are the genes you can see. And in the multigene ovarian cancer, like multigene testing, we can see in the NCCN guideline that there are strong evidences for few genes other than BRCA1 and BRCA2, and there are also lower penetrance genes which is also there in the other than the BRCA2 and the upper panel also. So that is there. So multigene testing can reveal different other variants in different other genes which also can contribute to the ovarian cancer, hereditary factor of the ovarian cancer. So the hereditary cancer have different overlapping genes. Like in only one gene can contribute to the different cancer. Like TP53 can contribute to pancreatic cancer, melanoma, breast cancer, ovarian cancer, also in colorectal. But when you see the percentage, you can see here they are contributing 3% in CDH1, MSH6, 4%. So they are also having a familial factor for next generation as well. So you can see in this thing why we need to see the hereditary factor for the ovarian cancer as well. Because when we have two normal genes, then the two hit mechanism actually acts. When we have one gene already defected from our parents, then the next gene getting affected and increasing the risk of tumor development is very early. So we need to screen the familial factors as well for this. There are also different somatic mutations in different genes. It is not only BRCA1 and BRCA2, though there are guidelines that it says BRCA1 and BRCA2, if it is negative in germline, then somatic genes can be tested. So it is not only BRCA1 and BRCA2, newer update says that these other genes also should be tested. And there are therapies based on this. So it is a multi-step process for any genetic testing. Identify at risk patient, provide pre-test counseling, which is very important, provide informed consent, and then select the test and disclosure of the result. And after disclosure of the result, there is a very important part, that is the genetic counseling. So when we disclose the result, it can be positive, negative, or it can be uncertain. A positive result for a thing, it is not just that it will ultimately develop to a cancer. In case of anything, it is not in pancreatic, it is not in like ovarian cancer or breast cancer, but they have a higher risk for developing cancer that can be monitored by increased screening, preventive surgery, or maybe different kind of chemoprevention. This might also help, like oral contraceptive, pregnancy, lactation, and this go on. And if it is a negative result, then it doesn't mean that the patient will not have any like familial factor for that, because there are different other genes which might contribute to this ovarian cancer, but may be unknown. But there is also possibility of getting only somatic mutations. Results can be VUS also, which is uncertain. However, this VUS should be very well explained to the patient with the genetic counseling, because this VUS with the evidences, it becomes either benign or pathogenic mutations, which need to be clarified to the patient. But at the present status, those VUS will not have any clinical relevance for the therapy. So is it helpful for therapy if we get any mutation? Yes, there are few genes which are known to have like mutations in the genes which are known to have FDA approved therapy, like in the case of BRCA1 and BRCA2. If you see in the ovarian cancer, uh, they have PARP inhibitors. These are the PARP inhibitor you have, and they can be given for the somatic and germline condition. But yes, they are not the first line therapy. There are proper guideline for that, and this is the thing, they can be used in either maintenance or treatment with the combinations also. So this is not only three, niraparib, olaparib, or rucaparib. There are other targeted therapies as well: entrectinib, larotrectinib, trametinib, or pembrolizumab. These are not very well included in other guidelines, and it is there only in this newer version of NCCN. And you can see that entrectinib and larotrectinib is for the NTRK fusions. But some studies says actually entrectinib and larotrectinib affects the abnormal NTRK protein. So that's how it it can be used as a targeted therapy. So any abnormal expression of the NTRK gene may be affected by the entrectinib and larotrectinib. That's why it is included. So these are the things. So I'll conclude with the take-home points. So the major part is identified at-risk population for molecular characterization test-wise. So we can do more genes, but more question will arise, more complexity. And we need a knowledge-based research thing to customize comprehensive report, which can actually help us for the therapeutic aspects. And it can also include in the newer technology. So increasing use of molecular testing, prognostic and predictive tool, customized targeted therapies to each individual, because if it is an ovarian cancer also, no two ovarian cancers are similar. So we need to categorize them histologically, we need to step and we need to stage, and then molecular also we need to stage if that patient can get targeted therapies or not. So molecular characterization is also very important. If molecular characterization for the ovarian cancer has is possible, then it can open different newer era for the precision medicine. What is the upcoming thing? It is like ctDNA is there in the market. It is like without doing any biopsy or any invasive surgery, we can detect uh, these somatic mutations in the blood sample itself. So it is not very well implicated now, but yes, the BRCA1 and BRCA2 assays are available in the market and they can be done, but they still need validation. It is included in the NCCN guideline as well, but they still need validation, because there is germline testing, like the germline variants also there, and there are possibility of getting somatic variants. So that should be ruled out before reporting.
Thank you very much, Aditi. That was a fantastic lecture.
Thank
We
you.
will now move on to the next lecture, but please remain logged in. We will have questions that can be addressed to you, and that will be taken after the panel discussion. Now we move on to Dr. Hemant Tongaonkar, a dear friend of I think 40 years. He is a senior gynec oncologist and genitourinary oncologist. Was with me at Tata Hospital, and now he is international fame colleague. So Hemant, over to you. And our focus is primarily for how to manage ovarian cancer in the elderly population. Over to you, Hemant.
Good evening, everybody. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Well, first of all, thank you, Purvish, for inviting me and asking me to speak on a topic which we see very commonly in our real world situation, but we hardly ever speak about it, hardly ever give a thought to it. And that is why it is very nice that you gave me this topic so I could read a lot about it also. Well, ovarian cancer is the third commonest cancer in women and the most lethal gynecological cancer, with the highest disease-related mortality amongst all gynae malignancies. Now, it is a disease of the elderly. More than 50% in the Western data, or more than 65 years, And over 70% of the deaths from ovarian cancer are also in this age group. We don't have an authentic Indian data. Obviously, our life expectancy in women is not so much, but at least 25 to 30% of patients that we see with ovarian cancer are over 65 years of age. But with increasing life expectancy, cancer incidence in the older population is on the rise. And it is expected that we will see more and more ovarian cancers in the elderly over the years. When we talk about elderly, there is no consensus as what exactly is elderly. Most people use 65 is the cutoff limit, but there are various trials in the literature which have used different cutoffs. So it's very difficult to interpret results. Some have even used words like young old, older old, and oldest old. So that's really a problem. However, globally, it has been seen that survival outcomes are poor in older patients. If you look at this population-based data of nearly 30,000 patients in one trial and about nearly 50,000 in the other, but across all stages, younger women have a significant survival benefit over older patients. And this is especially seen in stages 3 and 4 and not so much in the early stages. Now, why is this survival outcome poor in older patients? They're probably more aggressive, higher grade cancers with adverse tumor biology. Most are diagnosed in advanced stages. There is also an inherent resistance to chemo in older women. The individual patient factors like multiple comorbidities, polypharmacotherapy, and malnutrition, which leads to a greater toxicity of therapy. There's high frequency of sarcopenia and functional impairment. And of course, there is a physician and healthcare bias towards older women. That is why there is inappropriately inadequate surgery and suboptimal chemo in many patients. Well, sometimes it is justified. It's the appropriate clinical decisions. But most of the times, if a lady who is 75 comes to me, I think, well, she's 75. Do I really need to do an aggressive surgery? Well, I look at the chronological age, and that's not the right thing to do. They're less likely to be treated by gynae oncologists, and there's poor enrollment in practice-changing clinical trials. So the way we treat them is what is extrapolated from the trials involving younger patients. That's not an ideal situation. In early stage disease, we know that apart from THBSO, we need to also do some staging maneuvers. But here in elderly patients, we can certainly do away with the para-aortic lymphadenectomy if the lymph nodes are not enlarged during surgery. So that brings down the extent of surgery without really affecting the survivals. Also, adjuvant chemotherapy may be avoided if staging is comprehensive, and this is the combined ICON action data, which says that patients who are comprehensively staged may not benefit with adjuvant chemotherapy. What about advanced epithelial ovarian cancer? What we need here is aggressive, good cytoreductive surgery with the aim of macroscopically complete resection of all visible tumor and a good platinum-based chemotherapy if you want to achieve optimal results. So we need to do everything properly every step of the way if you want to have good results. And it has been seen consistently over the years that residual tumor after surgery is the most important prognostic factor that impacts outcomes. So here, if the patients have no microscopic disease, obviously will do much better than those who have microscopic disease. It's important how much you remove, but it is even more important how much you leave behind. And as per the current definition, the optimal or cytoreduction is the same as complete cytoreduction. That means you remove all the disease at all primary and metastatic sites, because no residual disease has been shown to give better survivals, much better survivals than those in whom less than 1 centimeter residual disease has been left behind at the end of surgery. And to do a complete cytoreduction, apart from the routine surgery for ovarian cancer, we need to do a lot of additional upper abdominal surgical procedures, the so-called ultra-radical procedures like liver resections, splenectomy, diaphragmatic resections, bowel resections, and these are needed in almost about 50% of patients. So to reach that level, we need to do subject nearly 50% of patients to this. Of course, with the LION trial being published, the lymphadenectomy can certainly be omitted in patients in whom the lymph nodes are not enlarged. And with this kind of surgery, the survivals, which were traditionally just about 15 to 25%, have now gone up to about 45%. And this is seen in most centers. But if you look at the real world situation, surgery for ovarian cancer in elderly women is always less than optimum. There is a lower rate of cytoreductive surgery, so surgery is underused, it's less aggressive, there are lower rates of optimal cytoreduction, they have less extensive surgery, especially upper abdominal and RPLND. There are more treatment-related complications and mortality, and morbidity can prevent or delay initiation of surgery, initiation of chemo after surgery. So look at the data of primary cytoreductive surgery, and you will find that increased rates of ICU admissions, major morbidity and mortality is seen consistently. So aggressive surgical effort in elderly frail women may be associated with an increased mortality and morbidity due to diminished physiological reserve to combat such a big surgical trauma. And if you look at the mortality figures, the CR data, if you see, as the age goes up, the mortality increases. The situation is elective, it is less. If it's emergency situation, it is more. Similar figures from Mayo Clinic, 3-month postoperative mortality ranging from 4% in 65 to 69 age group to 25% in women more than 80 years of age. What about this? One part was morbidity. What about adequacy of surgery? Look at all this data. I'm not going to go through all this because we have a shortage of time, but all this will tell you that the results in terms of optimal or complete cytoreduction are universally low, lower than what we expect. As I said earlier, we want a complete cytoreduction we can achieve in almost about 90% of our patients, while here, if you see, the rates are significantly less. And then we have the other option of neoadjuvant chemotherapy, which in the randomized trials has been shown to be as good as primary surgery. Now, one must understand that although there is an equivalence, there are some patients in whom primary surgery may produce better outcomes, like 3A, 3B, and 3C less than 5 centimeters. And these patients must not be denied the opportunity of cure, and the treatment selection must be done by a gynae-oncologist. Now, one question that we always need to ask is the clinician must decide whether the patient is candidate for primary surgery or not. For that, he has to take into consideration 2 questions. Whether the surgical standards of complete cytoreduction can be achieved safely with an acceptable morbidity. That means the disease is such that it can be completely cytoreduced safely, and whether the patient's performance status and geriatric assessment permits extensive surgery. Now, if yes, then of course primary cytoreductive surgery can be done. But here again, diagnostic laparoscopy before laparotomy is a very good idea. It will, since our imaging studies do not have an accuracy that is good enough to be the gold standard, diagnostic laparoscopy will, with Fagotti score, will give you a much better idea of resectability. And carefully selected elderly patients can tolerate standard, aggressive, radical, and ultra-radical surgical treatment. But the most important word is carefully selected. And how do we select that? We'll come to that. If the surgical standards cannot be met safely, if the patient's medical status precludes major surgery, that is in patients with modified Charlson comorbidity index more than 3, then neoadjuvant chemotherapy and interval surgery should be done. One should not try to downscale the surgery and insist on primary cytoreduction. That I will do primary cytoreduction, but I will not do the aggressive surgery. I will only do a little bit. Don't do that. Much better to put the patient on neoadjuvant chemotherapy and interval surgery, because you get higher rates of optimal cytoreduction, lower perioperative morbidity and mortality with neoadjuvant chemotherapy. It also increases the number of patients who get both chemo and surgery, and selection of chemo-responsive subgroup for surgery will obviously improve outcomes. Now, Aleti did a retrospective analysis of patients undergoing PCS at 3 tertiary cancer centers And he found the high-risk subgroup which was unlikely to benefit from primary cytoreduction. The stage 4 patients, high initial tumor distribution, poor performance status, poor nutritional status, and age more than 75 years. And here the median OS was just 17 months as compared to 40 months in overall study population. So this subgroup certainly should not have primary surgery. You should consider NSCT. Now, should all the patients receive neoadjuvant chemotherapy? Well, as I said earlier, there is a subgroup of patients who will benefit with primary surgery, and there we have to make the decision whether it can be safely done or not based on certain factors. In our practice, hardly anybody uses those geriatric assessment scales or scores, and I was not even aware that such things do exist till about a year ago. But then, do we base our selection on chronological age or biological age? Traditionally, chronological age, when we say, okay, this patient should not have surgery, she's 75, she's 72, whatever. And this we supplement by using performance score. And then we say, oh, it's my intuition, surgeon's intuition. I feel she will not do well. I feel she will tolerate surgery well. Well, instead of that, we can calculate the biological age by using the frailty indices. Frailty is very, very important. What does frailty mean? It means that reduced homeostatic reserve or reduced capacity of dealing with stress, which is an independent prognosticator of death after adjusting for all known risk factors. And that's why we can calculate this frailty by using indices. For example, modified Charlson comorbidity index, and decide whether the patient is going to have a safe post-operative course or she is going to have a lot of morbidity and even a mortality.
Hemant, sorry for interrupting. I know there are so many interesting points that need to be discussed. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. So can you just summarize in 1 minute?
Yeah. Last time. So we have these geriatric assessment scales which should be used. I will not talk about this thing. So basically, an aging population with increased incidence of ovarian cancer means that we should be treating a significant number of older, potentially frailer patients, and expertise with geriatric oncology will be increasingly required. We need to use these predictive indices in a prospective manner and enroll older and frailer patients into clinical trials. So as far as possible, as far as safely possible, standard treatment protocol should be followed, and selection is important. The time is now to give special attention to this special population. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hemant. That was absolutely fantastic. And your focus on fitness to ensure that patients are, fit to take the therapy can also be seen about your own fitness. I can see in the background that you are trying to remain fit. And I think that all of us need to do that in this COVID era to make sure that we maintain our good health.
Thank you.
Thanks once more, Hemant. And there will be some questions that we will give to you. So please continue to be online. In the meantime, it is my privilege to invite Dr. Amit Bhatt. He is director of Avinash Cancer Clinic and a dear friend who has going to talk to us about his thoughts on what is new in the ovarian cancer management in 2020. Amit, over to you, please.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Pixar and Ina Creations, for hosting this meeting and inviting me. And the topic is what is new in ovarian cancer management. And the addition I made is 2020. So 2020 has been quite a difficult year for all of us. 2020 really hanging on for dear life. We changed our ways of practice. That is me in the OPD, and we changed our ways of practice. And you can hear me, right? Hello?
Yes, sir, we can hear you, sir.
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah. So you can. So we change our ways of practice, and then in adversity, invention is there, and that is a necessity. And then we got innovative means of new inventions and going ahead with things that not are usually there. And ovarian cancer is also such a kind of adversity where a lot of new innovations are there. And going on to 2020 innovations, let me go back to the future. In 2013, This was a slide in American Association of Cancer Research Journal where we talked about a lot of new targets coming up. And in the last 7 years, we have done justice to most of these molecules. Some of the molecules have not seen the light of the day, but most of them are now there in practice. And when looking at 2020, what is new? It was like more than 900 really important articles published in 2020. So my presentation is going to be like the Aaj Tak rapid fire news, and I'll just go and breeze through the most important points. A word about chemotherapy. We all know about chemotherapy. This is something which we know, but was published in Lancet Oncology May 2020, where in recurrent ovarian cancer, they used a chemotherapy arm of liposomal doxorubicin pegylated with bevacizumab, and they showed that this is the standard of care and the first choice regimen with a PFS benefit. I won't go into details, but in recurrent ovarian cancer, the upfront is pegylated liposomal doxorubicin, platinum, and bevacizumab. Now, this has been the story of the entire 2020 PARP inhibitors. Everyone jumping onto the bandwagon, and so many new drugs coming up. PARP inhibitors has been there in ovarian cancer right from 2014. Olaparib came, then 2016 rucaparib got its FDA approval. 2019 niraparib got its approval, and all three drugs have been approved. And now, just looking at the approvals, olaparib, it was the clinical trials. I'm not going to discuss the clinical trials; they are available on the net for reading. Olaparib used in adult patients with BRCA mutations, and also approved now for maintenance disease who have after platinum. Rucaparib again can be mutations. The caveat here was generic, both germline and somatic mutations. So it's important that we understand that it's not only the mutated BRCA mutated germline mutations. Even if there is a somatic mutation, it works. I'll elucidate that in a few moments. And again, Ariel 3 rucaparib used again in maintenance, and niraparib has also come up in maintenance. This is the latest in PARP inhibitors, September 2020, Annals of Oncology, ESMO presentation by Dr. Susana Banerjee, and maintenance olaparib, a 5-year follow-up of the SOLO-1. So what was SOLO-1 was the trial of using olaparib as a maintenance monotherapy. We already have bevacizumab. We are using that in routine practice, and now this is a new therapy which comes for maintenance. And this was given for 2 years post-treatment. And as per physician's discretion, you could continue more than 2 years. And the treatment, the last line of the slide, the median disease-free survival was 56 months, was at 13.8 months. So that was a significant difference in survivals. And again, now olaparib maintenance at 5 years also should benefit. So this becomes again the standard of care. And coming on to these three PARPs, there are two new PARPs inhibitors, talazoparib and nalaparib, but now data is still coming up for the other two. But right now, yes, olaparib, rucaparib, and niraparib both are there. US FDA approved, and now it's time that we start using this for those patients. Obviously, pharmacoeconomics is a concern, but yes, we should be starting using this because these agents have been proven without doubt that they really benefit. Now, combination, the next obviously thought in mind was to combine olaparib and bevacizumab, both maintenance agents used in ovarian cancer. And again, combination of these two was significant. I won't go into the survival data. Only thing I would like to highlight over here is the 4 categories. So the tumor with BRCA mutation, they showed a difference. The patients without BRCA mutation and BRCA mutations, they also showed a, so to which category you fell, the combination of olaparib plus bevacizumab really showed a difference. This is again now of care. Now, next obvious was a chemotherapy-free regime. So this is a trial with bevacizumab, a published trial with bevacizumab and niraparib versus niraparib alone. And the aim was to give upfront a chemotherapy-free regime in recurrent platinum-sensitive ovarian cancer. And it's very important. This is platinum-sensitive disease. So in platinum-sensitive, usually prefer platinum, but this was a trial where the entire chemotherapy arm was excluded. And again, the PFS data is available, which was published in ASCO in May. And PFS was 12.5 versus 5.5 months, which is again significant. So this again really opens up new doors that can we offer chemotherapy-free regime to our recurrent platinum sensitive patients. That's all about PARP inhibitors. Now coming to antibody drug conjugates, we are very having good experience with TDM1 in breast cancer, and antibody drug conjugates are using an antibody targeted at the tumor. So where we can use a toxic but a potent chemotherapy drug, and we can directly put it inside the tumor with the help of a target or a linker. So the drug which was again published in July 2020, and this data was published in ASCO, mirvetuximab soravtansine. So this really showed 64% overall response rate, which is in metastatic, and are there with this. We're going to see a lot of the early next year for this drug. Immuno-oncology, now that's the talk of almost every cancer, every meeting, every cancer we talk about. Highlight of immuno-oncology came with the keynote 15, where ovarian cancer was included. This was keynote, ovarian cancer, there were 15 cases, and there was approximately 33% response. And this gave to rise to newer trials with immuno-oncology in ovarian. But really, immuno-oncology didn't really make that difference, like we see in lung cancers or other malignancies, but or in melanoma. So Javelin with avelumab, again both negative trials. With bevacizumab with checkpoint inhibitors, and so on and so forth. So we are really looking up to the data of that. The only significant trial which I found was in July 2020. So this was a JAMA publication, a small trial, 40 patients. It was immunotherapy, pembrolizumab with bevacizumab with oral endoxan, and median PFS was 10 months. The most important part of this was those who had platinum sensitive disease, the median PFS was 20.2 months versus those 7.6 for those who did not. So oral endoxan and immunotherapy, again, this can be used in practice. These are newer trials which will come up, and probably next 2 to 4 years, we are going to have data with all these permutation combinations of PARP inhibitors, immunotherapy drugs, placebos, and chemotherapy. Now coming on to molecular oncology, my favorite, we spoke about ctDNA in the first day, and probably this is going to revolutionize treatment as we do it in the future. This was an October 2020 article, ctDNA, this is a rough article which looked at many papers and how ctDNA is useful. I won't go into the detail of that, but over the last, say, 2-3 years, a lot of papers publishing about looking at specific mutations or gene panels or gene mutation profiles. So the only significant which I found was one, it is very important to understand that this is the first time a world body has come out with the clear-cut recommendation. Now, most of our NCCN guidelines or ASCO guidelines say that NGS can be done, and there is always ambiguity around the NGS. Now, ESMO in this recommendation published last month in Annals of Oncology clearly mentions that ESMO recommends routine use of NGS on tumor samples in non-small cell lung cancer, prostate, ovarian, and cholangiocarcinoma. This is a very nice paper. Everyone should go back and read it. But this is the first time, and ESMO says that it should be in routine use in ovarian cancers. Last few slides, this is a prognostic gene expression. This is where molecular oncology makes a difference. This is more of like we use in breast cancer. This is a similar kind of OTA spot, which gives us a screening of how good or how bad our tumor is, and this helps in risk stratification. There are 3 groups. They have and predicting survival 0.5 in quintile 1, which is the prognostic group, and 3 in quintile 3, which is the bad prognostic group. Last is the latest armamentarium. Lot many new drugs coming up. Vaccines are there. Unfortunately, this is the Pfizer vaccine, which got derailed once the corona came, and Pfizer took out its focus from ovarian cancer and went to corona. But this is the Pfizer vaccine, which phase 3 trial was supposed to start. A lot of other therapies are there. I'll talk about gene therapy. This is quite interesting. Ofranergen. So this is VB11, and this is again a combination of angiogenesis using an adenovirus factor, and this is response rates were as high as almost 60% in this phase 1, phase 2 trials. And again, this is in combination with paclitaxel, which is our go-to drug in ovarian cancer. The combination is there, and this trial would be published probably in next year ASCO. So coming back to the last slide, we have almost used all the molecules, and all the molecules are there. PARP inhibitors are the find in 2020, and the take-home message, probably the single take-home message that I would give to everyone is, please look for BRCA mutation in every ovarian cancer patient. And so probably what is coming now is probably much better than what is gone, and old is gold is probably now going to be an epitaph, and this is going to be the new dictum. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Amit. That was fantastic. You not only took us through what is happening over the years, but also focused on what is there in 2020. And like you mentioned, it's really exciting that we have so many targets on which we can, hope to treat the patients in a very precise manner and give personalized oncology. So I'm sure there will be a lot of questions for you, Amit. Please stay on. In the meantime, we move on to another exciting part of the session, and that is the debate. Now, we have a debate on whether patients of ovarian cancer should receive maintenance therapy or should be on observation only. And for the in favor of maintenance, we have none other than Dr. Amit Rautan, who is there from Bangalore. And then we will have Rajiv Vijay Kumar, who's also, both of them are really dear friends. So can I hand over to Amit for the first part of the debate, please?
Thank you, sir. Good evening, everyone. I thank Dr. Parekh sir for giving me this opportunity today. So my topic is speaking for of first-line treatment in ovarian cancer management. This is a curve we have seen for many years. And what we see is when we treat stage 3 and 4 ovarian cancer patients, even the best of treatments, we're talking of best of surgery and adjuvant chemotherapy, 50% of our patients have relapsed by the time they have crossed 1.5 years. The median PFS is 18.2 months. And if you see at 5 years, only 30% of patients are progression free. The rest of them all have progressed. We have tried to beat this reality for many years. We have tried different ways. We have tried dose-dense chemotherapy, which succeeded at least in the Japanese population, but did not in the West. We have tried intraperitoneal chemotherapy, which is good, but tough to do. And we have tried HIPEC, which is very, very tough and very difficult to do, but still effective in certain group of patients. So we've not been able to raise this bar, and this is what we have to do if we want patients to get better. And unfortunately, 75% of our patients are in this group, stage 3 and 4. So we had the bevacizumab data, which came out many years. We discussed this many times. The PFS benefit, 0.72, 0.81. There is a benefit, but none of us are happy about this. We say this much benefit is really not great for our patients. But we have seen the overall survival outcomes of the bevacizumab data in the high-risk population. In the stage 4 patients, there is a definite OS benefit, probably around 8 to 9 months. And this even was shown in the ICON data. So we've seen it both from Europe and from the US, that there is an overall survival benefit in the high-risk population. But then what do we do for patients who are not high risk? And we are not happy with this much amount of benefit. So how do we get more benefit? And this is what we have been hearing all evening. We believe ovarian cancer is not one disease. We'd say 20% of patients have BRCA mutations. We tell 12% are germline, 8% are somatic. But we believe our additional 30% patients could be HRD deficient. So we have about 50% of patients who are HRD deficient or homologous recombinant deficient, whom we can do better in. And we've seen the SOLO-1 data already presented. Amit showed this to us. Olaparib versus placebo, first line after doing your surgery and finishing your treatment with chemotherapy in patients who are germline or somatic BRCA. And there was a clear improvement in progression-free survival, very, very significant. Now, this is where it comes in. You saw that curve in the comparator arm is exactly what we had seen many years back also with the chemotherapy. You're seeing 18 months, that's 12 months because it's counting from the time you finish the chemo. So at 18 months, your patients, 50% have already progressed when they were on observation. Now you see this curve at 3 years, clearly 60% of patients have not progressed. And what Amit showed us, that 5-year data was presented this ESMO, median PFS in the olaparib arm is 56 months. So how much better have we got? We talk of PFS getting doubling, in some trials, we say, oh, that's good. And we hear tripling and we say, oh, very good. Quadrupling, you're going 4 times. You had 13 months median PFS in observation arm, and you have 56 months median PFS this year reported in the SOLAR one. And this is amazing. There is really no doubt about this. And another thing is, we talk of stopping the olaparib. What would happen? 2 years treatment, and then they stopped. And you still see the curve is dropping slowly. So there is a benefit even after stopping the olaparib, and that makes a difference to us in treatment. Well, we are all waiting for overall survival, no doubt about it. I would agree with that. But we have some PFS2 data, which is again showing the benefit from the SOLO1 data. So clearly, for the BRCA1/2 mutant population, a way to go forward. But what do we do for patients who don't have a BRCA? So we have the other trial, which looked at PRIMA, looked at niraparib in the whole group population. Now here, these are higher risk patients, and PRIMA is a positive trial. We've seen niraparib versus observation in all the ovarian cancer patients, advanced disease. But when you divided this population into subgroups, here you have the BRCA mutant population, again a hazard of 0.4, clearly significant. HRD population, which is BRCA negative but HRD positive, hazard of 0.5. And so this is an additional benefit to 30% of your patients. And if you're HRD proficient, there is still some benefit. It's hazard of 0.68. But yes, I would agree here the benefit is a little less. But FDA looked at that data and FDA approved niraparib for all advanced ovarian cancer patients, saying that yes, we do not have anything better to offer, at least even in the HRD proficient patients. So that is an approved drug which you could use. And recently we saw what happens when you have already using bevacizumab for many patients. When you layer in the olaparib in these patients, the PAOLA-1 data, patients who had surgery and then randomized to continuing the bevacizumab, which you would do for your high-risk patients, or continuing bevacizumab and adding olaparib for a duration of 2 years. And again, here we see the 3 populations. BRCA mutant, clear benefit, hazards of 0.56, no doubt about it. HRD positive, but BRCA non-mutant, again a hazard of 0.6, clear separation of the curves. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But when it is HRD negative here, you're not getting that benefit and the hazards are exactly the same. The curves are overlapping. So here we are learning one thing. In patients who are HRD proficient, you cannot say giving olaparib and bev is better because you're already giving the bev there. So this trial can only tell us that if we are using HRD as our marker, we can do olaparib bev in these patients who are mutant or HRD deficient. So how do I put my algorithm? This is my algorithm. If I have a BRCA1 and 2 mutation, it is germline or somatic, any one of them, I can use olaparib, the straightforward drug to use. We have the long-term data. If you are if you find you like niraparib, you can use niraparib. And if you are a person who has started bevacizumab for any reason, you can continue bevacizumab with olaparib. That's 20% of my patients. Now the remaining 30% who are BRCA negative but HRD positive, here I have an option. I can either do niraparib or I can do olaparib plus bevacizumab with the PAOLA data. And the last population, that 40–50% of patients who are BRCA negative, HRD negative, here's the problem. Now, because the PRIMA trial is positive, you can do niraparib, but yes, the benefit there is limited. So everyone can contend, we may not want to do it for that much benefit, which is absolutely fine. You can do bevacizumab, but you would do it only for your patients who have high risk disease, who have residual disease, or who are stage 4 disease, because that's where the benefit was, or you can do observation. So this is one arm where I will contend to Rajiv and say, yes, this is an arm you can use observation, but apart from this, there's no arm left there. So incorporating maintenance therapy, absolutely yes, no doubt about it, but choose wisely. Look at the indication properly. You're treating first line, second line. Look at the BRCA status. Look at the HRD status. Don't stop at BRCA. Amit made a point there. Always do a BRCA, but I would extend that point and say, if you're BRCA negative, please do an HRD. You'll add another 30% patients. Look at the toxicities of these drugs and learn how to manage these toxicities. See the schedule. Olaparib is 2 years. Niraparib was 3 years. Learn the schedule of olaparib plus bevacizumab, how to do it. If you're using it in later lines, look at how your toxicity of previous therapies are. And of course, cost will always play a factor. There's absolutely no doubt cost in India or anywhere, cost is always a major point in decision making. But if I look at it, maintenance therapy has a role to play in almost every ovarian cancer patient, except that small population whom we may say observation is good enough. So with this, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amit. As usual, You have lived up to your reputation of being a star, and you were even gracious enough to concede a small point to our rising star from Bangalore, Rajiv Vijay Kumar. So let's now move over to the other end of the debate. Observation for patients with ovarian cancer. Over to you, Rajiv.
Sir, you'll have to unmute your mic, sir. Rajiv, sir, you'll have to unmute your mic, sir.
Okay, is it audible now? Hi,
Yeah.
good evening. Thank you, Parik sir, for inviting us for this debate. It's very nice. So thank you, Dr. Amit Ratan, for starting the initial part of the debate. So okay, 1 minute. So the data supporting the use of maintenance therapy in ovarian cancer. Since December 2016, US FDA has approved 4 drugs for 6 different ovarian cancer maintenance indications. First, as maintenance for post second line, and then as maintenance post first line. We have an anti-angiogenic drug, bevacizumab, with the GOG 218, and the PARP inhibitors, olaparib. Then the other potential first line maintenance were niraparib, which has now come, just recently got the indication US FDA approval. Then veliparib, and then the Paola, where bevacizumab plus olaparib. So now Dr. Amit also mentioned regarding intraperitoneal chemotherapy, how we've been wanting to increase our survival in our patients. So does IP chemo give a good PFS compared to maintenance first line? This is something that we'll have to think of. I know it is difficult to do, but definitely it is doable. We are seeing almost around a 16-month difference when compared to the standard intravenous chemotherapy. This is something that we have to keep in mind. So this followed by a gap, and then followed by a second line chemotherapy. Then if you're using a PARP inhibitor or any other maintenance strategy, are we going to get PFS1 plus PFS2 plus PFS3? Is it going to be much more better? This is a question all of us have in our mind, and we have to actually get through that. So I will spare you these slides. There will be a lot of repetition because both of us, we've been alluding to the same thing, the GOG 218 and then the ICON 7, which we've used. So the maintenance trials, Beva was as a first line maintenance, GOG and ICON both showed that. And then other maintenance trials over the last 15 years, what have we tried? Maintenance paclitaxel, maintenance pazopanib. So, and then we realized that the PFS was not so great after completing the chemotherapy, similar to what Dr. Amit said. So we said, okay, let's just go in for it. So, and then we realized that all of these protocols and these which had come out for veliparib, olaparib, niraparib, so around the Paolo, which is olaparib plus bevacizumab. So PARP inhibitors post frontline chemo as a maintenance was first seen in the Solo 1 trial. All of us are well aware of this. So I'm going to spare you this. Here we are seeing that you can, like people would say, you can drive a truck through both the study arm as well as the placebo arm. Fantastic PFS benefit, undoubtedly. There is no question asked for that. And then came the primer trial. Here they used stage 3 with residual tumor after debulking surgery, and it was an inoperable stage 3. This is the kind of cases that they took. These are very high risk cases. That is the inclusion criteria for the niraparib arm. Here, that's what almost 85% of the patients had residual disease after primary debulking surgery. This is something that I want to actually emphasize on. This is not a regular carcinoma ovary patients where you've done a complete cytoreduction. Here, of course, in the HRD population, you're having a fantastic response. Here you can see that there's 50%, like 20% of BRCA, that's germline plus somatic, and around 30% of HRD population. So therefore, again, you're getting a very good response here. Again, I would like to allude to when you look at these curves, in the BRCA mutant, if it's BRCA, germline BRCA, you have a fantastic response. If it's somatic BRCA, you have a slightly better, slightly lesser response. And if it is HRD, the response is slightly lesser, even more. And in the HRD proficient, in the homologous recombination proficient arm, the response is not so fantastic, which Dr. Amit has very clearly mentioned. So again, in the Paola also, we saw that there is not much of the benefit is not too great by adding both olaparib and bevacizumab. So here, and this, which I would again specifically like to showcase this particular graph here in the homologous proficient or HRD negative group, the response is not great. And this accounts to more than 50% of our high-risk serous epithelial cancers. And high-risk serous epithelial cancers account to only 70% of our cancers. The 30% are the histology of lesser concentration. So like you have a clear cell and the other histologies that you have endometrioid. Over here, this data does not cannot be used on them. So in the PAOLA, what do we have? So the data shows activity of OLA plus bevacizumab in patients who have BRCA mutation negative but HRD positive. So finally, we have now the indications by FDA. Olaparib is used for maintenance in the first line. Rucaparib and Niraparib are mainly for in the second line that we have, although Niraparib has just got it now recently. So what is the advantage that we want to do by giving it as a first line? We do get some amount of advantage, but it is the cost of an immediate exposure to the serious adverse effects of olaparib and without any demonstrated survival benefit. The data is yet not mature for us to see too much of an OS advantage. We will have to wait before we can offer it to all our patients. 50% of our high-grade serous epithelial tumors would come into the HRD negative, BRCA negative subgroup. Do you actually want to give them and expose them to so much of toxicity? So now it is important for us to know the adverse effects of olaparib. They're frequent and sometimes serious. Around 3 to 5% of patients developed myelodysplastic syndrome and acute myeloid leukemia. Along with this, there's a higher chances of non-infectious pneumonitis and developing other cancers as well. People have told that it is due to the toxicity of the previous chemotherapies that they have received that had left to this, but yet nevertheless, with niraparib, there's an 18% chance of developing severe thrombocytopenia, which would lead to discontinuation of the drug. So now the current evidence suggests that olaparib has an unfavorable harm-benefit balance. So the marketing authorization should never have been granted on the basis of such a flimsy evaluation. So now for patients with ovarian cancer sensitive to platinum salts and a BRCA gene mutation, maintenance therapy with niraparib offers no clinical advantage over olaparib. This is just for comparison of both the drugs. Both drugs prolong the median time before requiring treatment with another cytotoxic drug by just over 1 year. There is no demonstrated survival benefit, and they frequently provoke sometimes very serious adverse effects. Again here, the harm-benefit balance of niraparib appears unfavorable in the absence of BRCA gene mutation. So the difficult question, to use or not use a PARP inhibitor, it is a very difficult choice. The point over here is you have to choose your patient. In patients with platinum sensitive ovarian cancer with the BRCA gene mutation, PARP prolongs the median time before exposure to another cytotoxic by a little over a year, but provides no survival benefit. Now this comes at the cost of immediate exposure to the risk of PARP inhibitors adverse effects, which are common and sometimes very serious. So the quality of life, when you see the quality of life, they have evaluated in many of these studies, but asthenia for a patient who's already had chemotherapy, who's just come out of it, any amount of fatigue, asthenia is going to actually put them down even more further. Do you actually want to give them so much of further therapy, continuously keep bombarding them and continue the asthenia? It's around 65 to 70% of patients have had fatigue and asthenia. Do you actually want to continue giving this? Although one might argue that it's only around 5% of patients had grade 4, but grade 2 and 3 encompass the bulk of the asthenia. So for making the cure more grievous than the endurance, oh good Lord, please forgive me. So this is the, with this I'd like to end saying that yes, maintenance is good in BRCA mutant and HRD positive patients, but in the rest of it, observation is where we should go to. And if we are able to give a good progression-free survival after first-line chemotherapy, and then afterwards use the drugs judiciously after second line, like how we did in the SOLO2 trial, I think we'd be able to get a better quality of life. Patients are going to be happy, and you're definitely going to cut down on the financial toxicity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rajiv. That was awesome. I think we recently had alignment between Uranus and Saturn. Some of us must have seen that and I could see that both of you were inching closer to each other. But the take-home message for the audience is really that there is a way of selecting the patients who should be on maintenance as opposed to those who are less likely to benefit from maintenance. And I think both of you have really refined what are the criteria that we should use in order to decide what is best for a particular patient, be it from the efficacy point of view or be it from the toxicity point of view. And I think both of you did a really fantastic job. I must congratulate Amit and Rajiv for that.
Thank you, sir.
And we will move on to the last penultimate part of the program, which is a case-based discussion on markers and ovarian cancer. The moderator is none other than my dear friend, the senior medical oncologist, Dr. T. Raja from Apollo Chennai, and he has been at the helm of moderating so many interesting panel discussions. All of them have been usually from his extensive personal cases and unusual presentations that have been happening. And along with him, the panelists are two surgical gynec oncologists, Dr. Amita Maheshwari from Mumbai and Dr. Monica Pansari from Bangalore. We have the molecular oncologist Amit Verma, who is extremely important for such a discussion. We have Abhishek Singh from Varanasi, and Reshma Puranik from Pune, and Chandan Das from Chandigarh. So these are all people who are passionate about academics, and I think Dr. Raja will be able to moderate all their thoughts very clearly. So over to you, Dr. Raja.
Ravish bhai, you're able to hear me, and
Yes, yes.
my slides are visible.
Absolutely.
And once again, very, very, many thanks to you. And shall I wish because everybody in our department, it was Merry Christmas, so I'll wish everyone Merry Christmas also. Okay. And I saw the panelist list, and when you sent me the first request, I had really prepared a heavily tilted biomarker and a MEDONC panel. But then, after seeing the panelists, I had to scramble and prepare some justice for our surgical colleagues also. I'll try my level best, Parvish bhai.
You are very nimble, so you can always manage to, do things at the last minute. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And here we go. See, this is a newly diagnosed advanced ovarian cancer. Look at that. And this is a real patient. And once we have a patient like this, and this happened June 2020, and that's the response we have got with the classical neoadjuvant doublet therapy. And we used only 2 drugs. We did not go with Amit Rathon's advice of using bevacizumab at this point. So when we see such a good response after an induction chemotherapy, of course, everyone would refer happily to our surgical oncology colleague. That's fine. But I want to ask Dr. Amita, would they automatically consider, apart from cytoreductive surgery, is HIPEC in the card? Is it a standard of care? What is your call, Dr.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Raja. So as of now, we do not routinely prescribe HIPEC to our patients, even in interval debulking setting. So we won't offer HIPEC to this patient.
I believe there is a very strong data set. Dr. Monica, do you agree or do you disagree? What is your practice, Dr. Monica?
Thank you, Dr. Purvish, first of all, for involving me in the discussion. Dr. Raja, I would like to take a question. In primary setting, as Dr. Amita said, we don't usually consider for HIPEC, but in recurrent setting, definitely I would like to offer HIPEC for this patient post cytoreduction.
Okay, so both the surgeons, my question is, the NEJM paper was
yes,
clearly beneficial.
yes.
I don't know whether Dr. Hemant would agree with both of you or he would differ. has got put all the money
He
on.
kind of agrees because he has written in the chat box, no great evidence. So he also
One
Yeah.
of the
agrees that.
Very nice to hear that all surgeons, want to. That's very nice. Thank you. But we
Dr. Raja, if we have a
it is Dr.
NEJM, although it has NEJM trial, but there was with this trial, so a couple of them was, relatively small sample size. There were, patients were randomized even before surgery, so there was a doubt about their selection bias. It's a small trial which ran over many years, so there was another concern about the quality of trial overall. And interestingly, center which contributed maximum number of patients into this trial had no benefit from HIPEC. So there were many problems with the trial.
Fine.
So
I understand. Thank you for clarifying. So now we'll move on into some other areas. As we have heard from our previous speakers, ovarian cancer has its own different morphological phenotype. So we know definitely it's not a single entity. That's fine. And then we also know that they can be broadly classified as type 1 and type 2. So then can I turn to Dr. Amit Verma? Type 1 and type 2, what is the complete interplay of molecular genetics of type 1 and type 2? And, what is your comment on that, Dr. Amit Verma?
So type 2, as you are showing in the graph, the PPT itself, they are high-grade histologies, and which have primarily the P53 mutation. And BRCA1, BRCA2 is also seen in those categories, and they are genomically unstable. On the other hand, the type 1 tend to be low grade, and they have various other mutations. And the BRCA1, BRCA2 is not commonly seen in type 1 category.
So when we are talking about molecularly profiling, ovarian cancer, are we not heavily loaded towards the type 2, Dr. Amit, or are we now capable of completely unraveling whatever it is, everything?
So as of now in our clinical practice, we do not do so many somatic alterations like what you are showing in this picture. But we tend to go for only germline most of the time. But yes, so our focus is primarily the type 2 and which are the commonest one as of now. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Amit. Now I'm coming to my med-oncs. We know, as we heard from Dr. Amit, we are still concentrating a lot on the, the type 2 diseases, preferably, not preferably by choice, the high-grade serous ovarian cancer, and most of our drive has been, gravitated towards the BRCA1 and 2. So we know that, and we all know that the BRCA1 and 2 can be identified on either the germline and also by somatic. This is one of our patients whom we have displayed both the the germline detection and also the somatic mutation detection. And we have also have another patient I have shown here who has got a BRCA2. The previous patient was BRCA1. So I'm going to turn to my med-oncs, Dr. Abhishek. BRCA1 and BRCA2, does that ring different bells for you when you try to make decisions on treatment, Dr. Abhishek? And whether it is somatic or germline, would that matter to you, Dr. Abhishek?
Hello.
Hello, Abhishek. Yes, we are able to hear you.
Yeah, sir. For BRCA mutations, if it is positive, I would. There is no difference for me for the treatment point of view. If I have to say BRCA1 and BRCA2, anything positive, I would consider it as a and definitely as the guidelines has come up, somatic mutations also should be considered if the germline mutations is negative.
So very correct. So crisply put, as of now, our treatment decisions are still germline or somatic. It's all the same as far as the treatment decision goes, except that, of course, when we are doing genetic counseling, probably you're going to discuss a lot about risk profiling and all. So there's a lot of discussion there, but I'm not going to go there because The topic panel is biomarkers and how do I manage. I'm not going into counseling yet, but I'll turn to Dr. Reshma. Dr. Reshma,
Yes, sir. Yeah.
would you, here is a patient that we had. This was in 2019, 54-year-old patient, and had a very high CA-125 advanced disease. And that's the scan. You can see the advanced disease, and this patient was treated with a very standard neoadjuvant approach, Paclitaxel carbo, and after 4 cycle shows an excellent resolution of most of the radiological finding. I hope you are able to appreciate the changes in the PET scan, the old and the new. And then, of course, at this point in time, we also have now started to do routine upfront screening. This is the report that I have. This is the germline BRCA2 mutated patients. And so what is your thought process? At this point, what are you starting to think, Dr. Reshma?
Sir, if she is having an excellent response and we have completed 4 cycles of NACT, we could refer her for a surgical oncology opinion.
We will do that, post that.
And so post the surgery, we would like to complete the adjuvant 2 cycles which are remaining. And if the patient is affording, sir, definitely would like to give her an option of PARP inhibitor maintenance, if the patient is affording.
So you're convinced by the Solo 1 presentation as
yes, because the recent data is showing quite a good PFS advantage, which is the recent 2020 data.
I'm having it for you, so you have no question that you would offer the patient on and olaparib. And there is other data set, Prima and so on and so forth, but it's not accessible. Let's be practical here. Dr. Chandan, would you have a Solo 1 approach or not? You've heard the debate also.
Yes, sir. I would love to use the Solo 1 approach. I think the patient is BRCA positive. Yes. I think there is hardly any significant advantage of addition of bevacizumab in this patient, especially those who are BRCA positive.
Okay.
If it's BRCA negative, I would have considered definitely HRD and all the Paola things.
Fine. So the question was more towards biomarker BRCA2 and how do we use it, and both of you agree that olaparib Solo 1 is convincing for you. You will go for it. That's what we did for this patient, and the patient is still doing well. On I think we have already got a PFS of 12 months. Hopefully we will reach more than that. The patient is on that. So let's move on to a more diverse situations that we may face. This is a second patient. This patient is a slightly elder, 68-year-old female, again advanced ovary, 2008 surgery and also adjuvant. But in April 2019 presents with a diffuse peritoneal and omental disease, and has got a relapse. And we started to treat the patient with relapse protocol. We considered this as initially we thought the patient is responding to that, but was developed some basal collapse consolidation and all that one, but could not tolerate the treatment. So that's what happened. She declined further therapy, and she is now 69, 70 years old, 69. So what do I do? So I'll begin with Dr. Abhishek. What do I do at this setting?
So what are the data about our germline mutations or status?
Right.
Because before offering anything, I think if we have a data of any BRCA mutations, then we can give some treatment in the form of
BRCA negative, Abhishek.
BRCA negative.
Can I just ask a question here, Amita? Here, a lady who has progressed on platinum, would you consider a PARP inhibitor in this patient?
That's a thought, Dr. Amita. That's what I was thinking our Abhishek would answer. So you are absolutely right. So the SOLA 2 is on the recurrent disease, but with BRCA mutated patients, obviously, and the SOLO 3 is on advanced patients who are platinum sensitive, but then again they have the germline BRCA. Both of you are right in one way, but as you rightly said, there are situations wherein, and this patient was clearly BRCA negative, but she declined everything else, and we said, okay, no problem, we will try olaparib. That's what we did. This was in August 2019. I'll show you the scans. This is what happened. Beautiful response, stunning. The patient was really in a poor, performance status. Now she is in very good performance status, unbelievable, and she is still on olaparib. So this is what I wanted to show you too.
Very interesting. BRCA negative
Absolutely.
and platinum refractory patient.
So, Dr. Reshma,
Yes.
do you have an explanation for this, Dr. Reshma?
Sir, there have been some trials in which platinum refractory and BRCA negative patients have been tested for these PARP inhibitors, and they are showing a good PFS response. So I think we need more trials in these patients also. But so there are some data in BRCA negative patients in resistant relapsed ovarian cancer, in which PARP inhibitors have been showing a response.
Yes, Dr. Reshma, you're right. So we'll come to that by illustrating another patient. So as you rightly said, this is the landscape of PARP inhibitors. Not only maintenance on the first line, let's say, there is a possibility of maintenance in second line, and then there is a possibility in place of chemo in the third line, so on and so forth. That's how it's an emerging landscape, but I probably hit the jackpot, that's all. But there must be an explanation to that. We'll come to that. Maybe Amit can answer that a little later. And there is a third patient bring, and this patient was diagnosed in 2013. And long story, and she had an advanced disease treated that did well, but she relapsed in 2017. And she was treated at that point in July 2017 with bevacizumab and single agent paclitaxel, did once again very well. And I'm showing you here that the BRCA was tested negative, and we also tested PD-L1. In 2017, we already established PD-L1 testing because of we had our students' projects going on, and one of our students was doing PD-L1 as one of his projects. And microsatellite stability was also already established in our hospital. Everything is stable. So this is the patient, and you can see the relapse in 2017, and FNA is positive, advanced disease. We treated, and you can see the response once again. Here you can see the response. All those lymph nodes, everything has disappeared. Neck node, everything has disappeared, and the patient has responded once again at this point. But I told you, this is what we had. This is NGS sent to Foundation 1 in 2017, August. You can see BRCA 1 and 2 negative. All the patient had was something like NF1 and TP53 and something like that. Dr. Amit, can you come in and help us on this situation? Young patient she was, we were desperately looking for, and she has responded once again to platinum. We were desperately looking for some answers, and she is negative on BRCA 1 and 2. Dr. Amit.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. So this is a very interesting case, a young patient, and does not have a somatic BRCA or germline BRCA, which is evident on the somatic testing. But she does have P53, which reflects that this is a type 2 kind of ovarian cancer. But addition to this, the patient have NF1 truncation mutation at the location 1412. So NF1 is the gene which is involved in the neurofibromatosis and which is involved in the activation of the MAP kinase pathway. So theoretically speaking, we do not have any drug approved for the targeting NF1. But yes, there are studies which talks about usage of mTOR inhibitors like everolimus or MEK inhibitors like trametinib in the patients who have germline NF1 or somatic NF1 if somebody wants to try. But having said that, NF1 per se also reflects that the patient have aggressive behavior, and also NF1 alteration reflects that the patient is hormone resistant if you want to try hormone in any cancer subtype, whether it is breast or ovarian cancer. So with this, I don't want to give any trial except the chemotherapy in this patient, and that is my take home for this interpretation.
Thank you, Dr. Amit. A very good explanation. But we couldn't, we went a little different their line. I'll come to that. And this is the full NGS report from. But Dr. Monica, we know very well that BRCA is one of the mutations. That's all, isn't it?
Right.
That be more driving the malignancy, isn't it?
Right.
So, so what is your take on BRCA and beyond, Dr. Monica?
Can you just repeat the question, Dr. Raja? I just missed it.
I just said that BRCA
Yeah.
1 and 2 is just one of the mutations, or one set of mutations that affect
Right.
August recombination machinery. There are many others.
Many other mutations, right?
So could that be an explanation here?
Yeah, definitely, sir. This could be the explanation why this lady has, though she's BRCA negative, but still has got a progressive disease. So as we know that type 1 ovarian cancer, they have multiple mutations other than BRCA, PTEN, and many other mutations described. So that could be one reason which could be explained here.
Dr. Chandan, there are more than several of these mutations that can explain the HR repair pathway, but we are not able to detect all of these. What do we do with all these, array of information, Dr. Chandan?
Sir, I think the all these are can be considered as a homologous recombinant defect. BRCA is the one of the most common, and rest of the other things. So if the patient is BRCA negative and one of the other genes are positive, either you can do the foundation by LOH score, or if possible then MyRAD. If at all with Indian also the med genome HRD scoring, then I think we can use another PARP inhibitor in this subset of patient, and these are equally sensitive for the PARP agents. And we have the randomized trial data, randomized trial data of Quadra in the 4th line if it's niraparib is approved for HRD positive patients. So if patient is HRD is positive, then you can use this. I must say, but testing method is difficult.
You are absolutely right, Dr. Chandan. There are many ways to demonstrate this extended display of genetic interference, and as you rightly said, these are the ways you can demonstrate LOH and telomeric allelic imbalance and large-scale state transitions. You are absolutely right. So these are the extended explanations for what we are saying in the clinical. Yes. But is it possible? Yes, we did that. So 2018 March, we sent this for myriad genomic instability status, and we had a positive score. And that's the myriad instability positive status for this patient. This is in Feb 2018. So we spoke back to the Foundation 1. We told them, look, this is the situation, what is happening. So Foundation 1 agreed to go back and do LOH on that. And this is the LOH display of the patient. And Foundation 1 corrected their report, and from then on, they have validated their LOH based on our patient. From now on, if you ask for LOH and HRD, Foundation will do it. This is a patient way back in 2018, and therefore this patient was put on BRCA, PARP inhibitor, and this patient is still doing well, more than a year on PARP inhibitor. So that's what I wanted to say, how you can expand your use of this. And I have asked 5 more minutes from Kashish. At any time you can
I just want to say something. So probably yes. After this, the LOH thing, they incorporate the LOH data in that rucaparib trial. Yes. Ariel and other trial, they actually incorporate the LOH depending on the LOH high and low. So probably that is.
Yeah, that's right. No, they had not validated the score in which they will call high and low. See, I have put it as 33.17 here. There is still no definite cutoff in all those clinical trials. There are different cutoffs, but I think the Foundation 1 itself has settled down on a score of 30. That's what they told me. And they thanked me that I brought this patient back to them, and this is the history. So this is in 2018, my patient is still benefiting well. And at any point, Kashish, you can stop me. I have one more patient. And moving away from all these known BRCA mutation and HRD mutations, what if we have somebody like this? We have an advanced ovarian cancer. I send this for NGS testing, and I get this. And I get an FGFR 1 and 2 amplification. I get CDK4, CCND1 amplification. And I get all these, this is totally, confusing. So what do I do? Dr. Abhishek, you have an answer? Dr. Reshma, Dr. Chandan?
Yes, if I exhausted all the chemotherapy and patient is not in a shape of taking any injectable chemotherapy, I would love to use palbociclib or any CDK4/6 inhibitor. I think theoretically it's definitely going to work, right? CDK4 is amplified and it's actually shown in the liposarcoma studies. The CDK4 amplified, you give the CDK4/6 inhibitor, at least you achieve the stable digits. So I think it's
You are
theoretically
spot on,
working.
Dr. Chandan.
Sir,
We have put this
sir.
patient on palbociclib. The patient is once again shown. Let me see whether I have those images. Once again, maybe I can pull that image and show it to you. Very,
So
very
can I
response with
can I
palbociclib.
make a comment, Abhishek?
Yeah, please, Abhishek. Yeah.
Abhishek this side. Sir, so if palbociclib is obviously can be used here and data are there. So, but what about the oral metronomic chemotherapies, which if you don't have other
That's
options, and
another way of looking at
patient
it.
is
No, that's fine. But I have this, I have done a test. I have got the result. I have to act on it. And there must be a basis on what I'm doing.
so
And this is what
CDK4/6
I'm just
yeah, okay, fine.
presenting to you, that this is what we had, and this is what, and this is in 2018 I'm talking. And we had this report. We looked at this data set. It was available at that point. Then we went ahead and put the patient on palbociclib with letrozole. The patient is still doing very well. So that's what I wanted to show you. And moving on, completing the topic, if we see something like this, MSI high and MMR, are we keen to put these patients on checkpoint inhibitors? Do you believe in that? I'll just quickly go with our panelists, whether they agree to do checkpoint inhibitors on ovarian cancer when there is a MSI high. So may I begin with Abhishek, yes or no?
Yes, sir, we should do it.
Dr. Reshma?
Yes, we can give a chance, although the data are not that sufficient to recommend. But yes, if it is deficient, we could offer.
So just for the sake of everyone, I'm just, and this is the conclusion by a very elite panelists of ovarian specialists. In ovarian cancer, BRCA mutation is a strong predictor for PARP inhibitors. But then HRD is almost as predictive as PARP inhibitors, if you can't demonstrate the BRCA. And non-BRCA HRR mutations, the trouble is with, I didn't show those slides. If I have a RAD, if I have a PALB2, they are not going to be responding to PARP inhibitor unless you can show the HRD on them, HRD deficiency or an LOH. So you need to really show the effect of the mutation, then only they're going to respond. That's the key point. And so HRD status is very important, and then it will help you to go around doing all these things. So you can decide on your patient, with whether you want to do NACT or not, bevacizumab or not. And then once you cross and come over to the response situation, you can, whether the patient has got a BRCA mutation, you can go with either a solo one or a prima data, or if the patient is, if the patient has, if you are believing in doublet, you can use PARP inhibitors plus bevacizumab. And if the patient is really, homologous recombinant proficient, that means does not have deficiency, you can consider bevacizumab. So based on GOJ and ICON-7, and that's how you go about it. And that's my team. And thank you very much, all of you, for listening to me. And thank you, Parvish Bhai and Kashish, for this wonderful opportunity.
Thank you, sir.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Raja. And thank you all the panelists for making it extremely interactive. I think we should now take all the questions that have been put on the chat box. Can you share the questions, please? So we have the first question from Dr. Revati Sarvanan. Can you explain how tubal ligation can reduce the ovarian cancer risk? Hemant, can you answer this question, please? Hemant Pongaonkar.
Sure, I will. See, the definite mechanism by which this helps is not known, but there is a theory of what is called a reverse menstruation, wherein the blood comes into the peritoneal cavity and the femoral end is usually, it's constantly being exposed to that. And by some mechanism, which is some iron, something which I'm not a scientist, but with that, the risk of ovarian malignancy there increases. We know that most ovarian malignancies begin in the fallopian tube. So there is initially malignancy in the fallopian tube, and then it is also transferred to the ovary.
Right.
So if
Ajay,
you tubal ligation, obviously you're preventing the reverse menstruation.
perfect. Thank you. From Ajay Bafna, breast cancer neoadjuvant chemotherapy. We finish all chemotherapy cycles before surgery. Can this also be done in advanced ovarian cancer? Can I ask Dr. Raja to please answer this question? Dr. Raja is around?
Yeah. I'm here.
Go ahead.
We will finish all chemo cycles before surgery. Can it be done in advanced cancer ovary also? The current, the NACT was intended. Let's look at what is the benefit of NACT. The NACT was intended to improve the cytoreductive surgery rate. That's what, and achieving and near R0 resection. That was it did not change the overall survival outcome. So cytoreductive surgery seems to be a very important key as far as the ovary outcome goes. So as soon as it becomes surgically feasible, that's how this cytoreductive surgery has come into the picture. And so that's what I will understand. And continuing chemotherapy, and so I don't have randomized data or any data to support that answer.
Purvesh,
Yeah, Ahmed, go ahead.
there is data from the literature. It's not a randomized trial, but that every additional cycle of chemotherapy causes more incidence of chemoresistance, acquired chemoresistance, and reduces the survival by 2.5%. So that data is available, and that's why they say that the least number of chemotherapy cycles need to be given before the surgery.
So that is right.
Right. Monica, do you agree or do you have some other opinion?
I do agree with Dr. Hemant that least number of cycles. One more reason being this, that once, if you do cytoreduction post third cycle, you can assess the disease in a better way. Many a times patient would have responded when you give at the end of sixth cycle of chemo. If they are chemosensitive patients, the disease would have almost completely responded. And the assessment of disease becomes quite difficult at the end of sixth cycle of chemo when you're taking the patient for cytoreduction. So probably it would be better when we intervene in between. We can assess the disease better, cytoreduce, chemosensitivity part, all those things can be dealt with in a better way.
Fantastic. Dr. Amit Verma, this question I think I should go to you from Ajit Joseph. Any predictive markers for MDS AML? Can you go back to the previous slide? Due to PARP inhibitors.
So can you hear me, sir?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so most of the time what I have seen actually, patients have underlying ATM alteration. And on top of that, if they have a biallelic loss because of the BRCA alteration and we give PARP inhibitors, so you may see secondary cancers or leukemia is what we see. So an ATM is quite prevalent alteration. So, and though as it is recessive gene, it does not express that much, but any second underlying alteration can increases the chances of secondary malignancies because of the PARP inhibitor.
Excellent. We move to the next question. Dr. Satish has asked, how common do you see very good clinical and pathological responses? And any changes in adjuvant therapy other than adding bevacizumab? So is Amit Rautan here? Or Dr. Raja?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Amit, go ahead.
So clinical and pathological response, sir, it's always been the same thing. We give the neoadjuvant chemo with carbopacly as standard. Some of us do still use dose-dense chemotherapy, though the ICON data is negative, but we still believe in certain patients dose-dense chemo helps. But that's about it, sir. There's really nothing more to look for, anything more to add.
Okay, excellent. Can we go to the next question? This is a question from Dr. Tongaonkar, our faculty. The question is whether in the absence of BRCA positivity and HRD not tested, should we treat the patient with olaparib? Amit, can you take this question as well?
No, sir, I don't think we should do that. My thing comes to, it's very expensive therapy. And if we are not going to get the benefit, we should not do it blindly. So I would say if we are BRCA and HRD, then yes. And if we are negative for that, doubtful.
Thank you.
Especially when the drugs are expensive, I think
Right.
it is fair that we do the test before prescribing the drug.
Right, sir.
Yeah. Again, from Dr. Satish, important question. Any preferred chemotherapy regimen in first line in patients of CA ovary who are BRCA positive? Dr. Raja, are you there? Can you answer this?
Yes, sir, I'm here, and
Right.
that's a good question. One is even in BRCA positive patients, the induction chemotherapy or the first line chemotherapy still remains the same.
Right.
It is post that, you know, if you have a positive patient, first line maintenance is established, and if you have a positive patient, second line maintenance is established. And just adding to what Amit said, there is really strong data on emerging on maintenance even in patients who are BRCA unknown, as long as they are platinum sensitive. That's an emerging area of interest, but I would completely agree. Cost is a consideration, and we often see cytopenias when we use that, so we need to be careful with the drug.
Excellent. I think Satish, you had raised a hand. Can we unmute him, please? Can we unmute Satish? In the meantime, we'll take.
Satish sir, you'll have to unmute your mic.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
Go ahead.
So this regarding this one, there is a like a retrospective data is there. They're telling other than Paclitaxel, you can use a dose dense Paclitaxel. Don't use a weekly, like 3 weekly paclitaxel carbo if you have a BRCA positive. That's the one thing. Otherwise, you have a PLD, that is a liposomal doxorubicin platinum or gem carbo. There's a retrospective data is there. Is a data I can read up in the ASCO education book also is there regarding the first line, which chemotherapy protocol used to use in a BRCA positive CA ovary. But there is no randomized study with the what your retrospective data, what is there evidence for the PLD platinum or gem platinum is a preferred regimen in the first line BRCA positive CA ovary. Otherwise, if you want to use a weekly paclitaxel rather than 3 weekly paclitaxel with platinum,
Right.
that's what yes sir. This is what I
Excellent.
want to tell you.
Right.
Thank you,
right.
sir.
So nice.
Yes. Yeah.
Aditi has asked this question. How about trametinib? I'm not sure in what context she has asked, but she is still
No,
logged in. Can you please elaborate on your question?
Sir, I didn't ask. It was my suggestion for that NF1 mutant case.
Right. Right. Amit Verma, if you are there, can you answer this? Would you want to use or recommend this for mutated case of NF?
Sir, Amit sir is logged out.
Okay. Raja, can you answer this?
No, sir, I have not yet. I mean, is it are they talking about a BRAF mutated patient, or is the question specific to that?
So the case of Foundation Genetics with the NF1 mutant, it's the same
NF1,
thing. I just wanted that maybe we can use trametinib. That's what I meant.
right. I don't know the answer.
So I also don't know that answer.
Ravi sir, I just want to say something.
Yeah. Chandan, go ahead.
The trametinib is the recommended for the relapse low-grade serous ovarian cancer. That is a good data. And the other patients that exactly Aditi ma'am actually said, it's a NF1 mutant or any patient with KRAS mutant. We can use, sorry, NRAS mutant. You can use the trametinib or make mutation.
So this is very useful information, Chandan. Thank you so much. Any other question do we have? So I don't think we have any. Acha. How do you react in patients with BRCA VUS, variations of unknown significance, I think, as maintenance therapy? Raja, do you have any thoughts on this?
Don't know, sir, because unknown significance has been really. So the point is, if I can show a slide in which it's not only demonstrating the mutation, you need to show the effect of the mutation. For example, it's not enough to just show whether it's a BRCA 1 or 2, or then you expand it to RAD and this, so on and so forth. But if you are able to demonstrate the HRD score or the LOH, genomic instability, or there are other things, the telomeric, if you are able to demonstrate those changes, yes, then you have demonstrated homologous recombinant repair there, and that's when all your PARP inhibitors are going to work.
All right. One more thing that you could do is that you look at the publicly available databases like the BRCA Exchange and see whether this VUS has been assigned a causality at the time when you are looking at the patient. Maybe the report did not look at that data in a week's time or 10 days time, you have more information. So please don't take that VUS on face value. Please take the effort to just open your laptop and look at it on the BRCA Exchange. I think that could be extremely useful. So I think we have come through the questions, and thanks very much all the panelists. Thank you, Raja, for making it lively with your own very interesting and difficult cases. Thank you all the panelists and all the faculty for taking time off on Christmas Eve. And before we sign off, wishing all the faculty Merry Christmas and also a Happy New Year. We pray that 2021 will be totally different, safer and healthier for everybody as opposed to 2020. Thank you very much.